first. Welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series. This session is the Australia's National University Teaching Awards. The four winners from 2020, which is the most recent year, we'll be exploring in a panel session today. And the chair is Angela Carbone. Would you like to begin, please?
Thank you, Matt. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I live here in Carnegie, Melbourne, lockdown 4.0, so the city is in lockdown at the moment. We will be slowly coming out of lockdown tonight at midnight. I'm on the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people, but wherever we are, I pay my respects to the elders, both past, present and future. I also work at RMIT University, and RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Wurrung and Burrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. I also pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia and hope that the path towards reconciliation continues to be shared and embraced. So, welcome everybody. I can see people from all corners of the world, Italy, London, Japan, across Australia, US, so fantastic to see everyone. We're here to talk about assessment and what a hot topic that is at the moment, especially with the COVID disruption. We have seen universities rethink assessment. In particular, how do we make our assessment more authentic, and exploring what does that really mean? What does authentic assessment really mean? In addition, with the physical distancing restrictions, we are moving away from those large-scale invigilated exams and exploring how we can use the affordances of digital technologies to support our pedagogies, but also authentic assessment. As Matt has already mentioned, today we are joined by our four 2020 National Teaching Award recipients who come from across a variety of disciplines and who will be exploring assessment, in particular looking at assessing science communication skills, developing student agency and choice in assessment, using remote invigilated exams, and how will the digital age change the assessment experience. So let me introduce our panel, and then the way it'll work, each panel will give a 5-minute presentation, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions. So please type in your questions in the chat, which Matt has already explained how to get there. We've got lots of people attending, almost more than half of the people that have registered are in the session now. So let me introduce the panel. So 4 members. The first one I'd like to introduce is Associate Professor Jack Wang. So Jack was awarded the Australian University Teacher of the Year. That's the most prestigious award. He also got a Teaching Excellence Award in the category of Biological Sciences, Health and Related Studies for citizen scientists in the digital age. Jack is an academic in microbiology at the University of Queensland, where he challenges his students to learn through creating, analysing and communicating scientific findings to the masses in the discipline of microbiology and infectious diseases. We have Dr. Amanda White. Amanda was awarded the Teaching Excellence Award in the category of Law, Economics, Business and Related Studies. Amanda is the Deputy Head of Education of the Accounting Discipline at the University of Technology Sydney Business School, and she's an education-focused senior lecturer. She has almost 2 decades of teaching experience and is best known for her YouTube channel, Amanda Loves to Audit, which has over 51,000 subscribers. Amanda's work includes a focus on academic integrity and using technology to support student learning. The third panellist is Professor, and congratulations, Matt, for being promoted to Professor, Professor Matt Bauer. He received an award for teaching excellence in the category of science and social and behavioural sciences. Matt is an academic in education who inspires pre-service teachers about the immense potential of educational technologies through a range of cutting-edge and carefully sequenced design experiences. Matt has led institutional and national education technology projects and was instrumental in building the Australian Technologies Teacher Education Network community of practice. And finally, our fourth panellist is Associate Professor Matthew Cowling. Matthew was awarded a Teaching Excellence Award last year in the category of Physical Sciences and Related Studies. Michael is an academic in ICT, so Information and Computing Technologies at Central Queensland University, and is an award-winning technology strategist and communicator committed to fostering thoughtfulness in educational technology for students and educators. Michael is the founder of the Create Lab, where he leads collaborative research and engagement around technology and education. Today, Michael will be speaking about synchronous online experiences. How will the digital age change the teaching and assessment experience? All right, so first panellist is Jack Wang. Associate Professor Jack, over to you.
Thank you, Angela, and hello, everyone. My name is Jack Wang, and I'm from the University of Queensland. And the assessment task I want to talk to you today about is to do with science communication. But on this first slide, you can see a few screen grabs of the videos that we've been making to help students learn laboratory skills in microbiology. And this is a project that's funded by the Australian Council of Deans of Science, where they're trying to promote, remote learning of laboratory skills during this time. But what I want to get to really is that in laboratory training, there's one learning objective that's always there that we probably don't talk about as much as we need to, which is talking about, documenting, analyzing the findings. And too often this kind of communication assessment task is one target audience specific. So for scientific audiences, and communication, of course, varies depending on who you're talking to. So the task that we've put into place here at UQ is a task where we get the students involved in an undergraduate research project called the Human Microbiome. And this is a project where students are volunteers in a project, and they themselves go through a process of informed consent to swab different body sites and analyze what bacteria is growing. And this is actually a real research project that happens all over the world. And typically the limitation in this research is you don't have enough participants for it to be representative. But in the course that I teach, a second-year microbiology course at UQ, there's about 400 students or so. So we have quite a lot of statistical power if everyone chooses to participate from the student's point of view. And from that research project, there are two things that I want the students to do as part of this assessment task. So the first thing is they need to communicate the findings to a scientific audience, and that's this scary looking graph in the middle. Essentially, you see a breakdown of all the different bacteria that's detected in the students across different sites and sort of how abundant they are. And that's the classical way in which we assess communicating laboratory results. But the second part of this task is for them to make a podcast. And this podcast is not like a 2-hour thing. It's like a pretty short 5-minute podcast. And essentially, we want them then to focus the podcast not on scientific audiences, but instead on the general public using quote unquote lay language and really avoiding technical jargon. In fact, if they bog it down with scientific jargon, they lose marks. And the final bit of this design for the assessment task is that it's done in pairs. Now, I'm sure many of you probably run your own podcasts. I know a few of the presenters do. You'll know that podcasts are much more easy to do if you have a conversational partner as opposed to just monologuing in your own basement. And so in Queensland, we're very fortunate that COVID never forced us into full lockdown. The flip side of that is that we had students who were coming onto campus as well as students who were off campus. So creating that cohort experience is something that's quite difficult. So this task allowed us to use the group work pair mentality to have one student on campus and one student externally to conversationalize with each other and create this podcast together. Okay, so that's the task. From that single research project, they create 2 outlets of communication, one for scientific audiences and one for the general public. Now, what is the assessment criteria? So this is a very text-heavy slide. I obviously don't expect you to read all the text on screen. If you can just pay attention to what's on the left-hand side, it goes through the criteria that we use. And I'll break it down pretty basically. So essentially there is data presentation in the figure. So this really is communicating to the scientific audience how that figure looks, and it's formatted to the specifications of professional scientific journals in my area, as well as things like scientific accuracy and formatting. This is all communicating to a scientific audience, whereas there are also criteria for how appropriate the language is and how relevant was the speaker in connecting the messaging to a general audience. So there's criteria for both. And what was really interesting is that when we look at how they performed, the first thing you would think is, well, these are second-year students who don't know that much about the discipline. Surely scientific accuracy would not be the thing they do the best in. And this is data collected over 227 pairs of student participants. And you can see that actually, I mean, it's all relative, and they did pretty well in the task overall, but they actually performed the best in the scientific accuracy criteria, which was a little surprising to me. And the two boxes, the one on the left and one on the right, essentially denote the criteria that we're trying to look at communicating to a scientific audience versus in this light aqua color communicating to a general audience. And again, they didn't do terribly, but we were consistently marking them down for these types of criteria, which wasn't my expectation. I thought the students would all be already very adept at communicating to a general audience, but it seems like communication has much more depth to just they can figure it out. And irrespective of the audience type that they're communicating to, there are difficulties that we weren't anticipating the students would have. So maybe they spend a lot of time on other things apart from what they're going to say and how they communicate that message to the different audiences. And now I've got one last slide, and I want to emphasize this last point before I hand it over to the next panel member, and that's aligning the amount of time students spend on task and how that measures up against the learning objectives. And what we found is that students were spending a lot of time on maybe the wrong thing. So they were spending a lot of time on the technical production of the multimedia item they had to produce, which is a video or a podcast. So they were stressing about, looking pretty and having the right equipment and making the sound good. And I'm certainly guilty of that, trying to get it looking a certain way. When in fact, as we all know through this pandemic, if something is a little lower tech, but the presenter is very effusive, very engaging, that can overcome a lot of those issues. So to scaffold the student learning and really highlight what they should be spending more time on, we've spent a lot of time producing these how-to guides for software and equipment and how to get the right sounding audio, the right looking video, to maybe speed their way through that part of the process and really focus on the core communication skills, which at the end of the day is what matters most. All right, so that's the assessment task that I want to talk about, and I think I'll hand it over to the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Jack. Now we'll move on to Amanda. So over to you, Amanda.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm not the only non-professor, maybe one day in the future, but I want to thank everyone for coming along today and hearing us all. I love all the gear and no idea. It's a common saying in photography, videography, filmmaking, and I am, as you might see from my background, very addicted to buying gear. So today I wanted to talk about agency and student assessment. Like Jack, communication skills for business students, especially accountants, is really critical. When we talk to the profession about what are the skills that students need, interpersonal communication is always the critical soft skill. And we think that students should be good at talking to each other. They do it all the time, but communicating in a professional sense is quite difficult. So here was the situation. I have a course intended learning outcome about oral communication, and like many business schools, we have lots of challenges around international cohorts. So 50% of the accounting cohort we have are international students with varying levels of English language ability. Unfortunately, I have no control over the IELTS level of our students and input pathways, which does affect their communication skills. And added to that is COVID-19, where a lot of our international students actually went home. So they've decided to complete the majority of their studies or the remainder of their studies overseas. And they're not getting that everyday classroom interaction down at the shops, working at their part-time jobs, speaking in English. So they're only speaking in English quite often in their classes. And sometimes that's even very limited interaction. So we've got a lot of challenges with international students. And the other challenge is that students have different goals for what they want to achieve in their career. Some are, I'm at university, I'm going for a graduate job after my undergraduate degree, so I teach undergraduate. Others say, oh, look, I want to go and do further study, they're unsure. And so I used to assess communication skills with a graduate job style video interview. You get the question, it pops up on the screen, you need to be professionally presented, have good lighting, have your webcam at an appropriate angle, clear audio, not too distracting a background for a job interview. This is a bit different today. But students were saying, well, hang on, I don't necessarily want to go get a job. So we tried to figure out ways that we could increase student agency. So we've got lots of alignment of learning opportunities. We use peer instruction and team-based learning to have students communicate with each other a lot during the classes so that they can build up some of that confidence. And we provide student agency now in 3 ways of actually demonstrating to us communication skill. So a lot of students who are going for graduate jobs pick the video interview. They need that practice of wearing a suit or dressing up in a business professional manner, how to put their webcam together, and they get a question, they get 60 seconds to think about it, and then they have to respond talking about our subject matter area. The second option is for students who really want to stretch themselves. They think, oh, I'm pretty sure I'm pretty good at one-way communication, but I want to try and communicate with somebody live and be assessed on that. And we actually give some students the opportunity to interact and interview a guest, a member of our business community, gathering information as they would as an auditor or as an accountant, and being assessed on that. And then the third option is to make a video that they explain a particular issue or topic facing our industry. And this allows students to make a choice. These assessment items are held at different times during the semester, so they can pick a task that suits their assessment schedule. There are different skills in each of them. So students who feel very nervous about speaking off the cuff prefer to prepare something like the explainer video. And then we have some students who just say, look, I really want to stretch myself. And all of our students are assessed using exactly the same rubric. So they have the same criteria of how they're dressed, how they communicate using verbal communication, as well as non-verbal communication. So eye contact, or they're spending all of their time reading off their slides, what sort of hand gestures. And we actually give students a lot of scaffolded direction and tutorials on that. So I'm really lucky to have my co-teacher in my subject. She is a professional communicator as well as being an accountant. She teaches business professional communication. So it's even little things like you don't point because pointing looks bossy, even more so apparently when you're a woman. But there are things like the soft karate chop to make a point, where we teach students all of these little tips and tricks so that when they're communicating, whether that's for a job interview, a master's degree interview, or some other form of business communication, they're doing the best they can, and we're giving them that choice. And we found that students were much more engaged in their assessment task when they had choice of what to do. And we found that overall, students have actually improved their performance against our graduate attribute because they're actually picking something that they're more engaged with, and because they have that control, they tend to enjoy it a little bit better. So the outcomes, the assessment provides lots of flexibility. We work with students to discuss the pros and cons. So they work in groups to analyze each of the tasks and say, well, who would this be good for? Which task, which sort of person or style of learning would this be good for, so that they could know what suits them. It also helps us in terms of spreading the marking across the entire semester. So students really appreciate the flexibility. We like actually marking different sorts of assessments, so it's nicer than marking 300 of the same. We get a nice variety as well, and students really appreciate that. So that's all that I've got, and now we move on to Matt.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So our third panelist is Matt Bauer. So over to you, Matt.
Hey, thanks very much. So when we were asked to talk about just a 5-minute snapshot of something assessment, the thing that immediately leapt to mind with relation to digital assessment was my recent experience, and I'm not sure how many people might be able to relate, with having to transmogrify my face-to-face exam in session 1 of last year into an online exam due to COVID. And I think the massive and radical impact of COVID on learning and teaching and online education, in many ways it's been the best thing ever for online education in terms of making people, forcing people to think about, well, what can we do with technology? And it was an interesting situation because the university wanted everyone to, that could possibly convert their exam to online, to make it online. At the same time, there were all the issues around invigilation and making sure the examination process was as fair as possible, that the university didn't have the infrastructure to support. So that immediately brings to mind, what are we as individual academics able to do in terms of making fair assessments? So the process for me was about really upfront doing a big information piece for students. Now, so this is, and again, just like Jack, you know, I'm not expecting people to read all of this, but there was a couple of pages of this sort of information for students. Needed to be extremely, because it's high stakes assessment at the end of the year, extremely carefully worded, really think through very precise and clear instructions. Then on the day of the exam, you had to also, you know, and just coincidentally, right before this session, I have just come from my second run of using this approach. So this was in session 1 of last year that we tried it for the first time, and due to student feedback, we're now doing it again this year, even though we had the option of continuing with face-to-face. But there needed to be really clear instructions on the day too, of what was going to happen and how to proceed. And part of that was about, well, what sort of invigilation can we do in order to try and uphold the integrity? And this is at a time where universities in Australia, in particular, are being challenged about, you know, the integrity of their assessment processes. So a couple of the things were to let students know, first of all, that they could be asked to share their screen at any time and how that was going to work. And also, as they were completing their quizzes online, to make sure that they had that photo uploaded into our Moodle learning management system, which we call iLearn, so that they, their identity can be paired to the person that we're seeing in the Zoom room. Then everyone came into Zoom. This is not a shot of the actual students for privacy and confidentiality reasons. This is just been scraped from the web. But that's a sort of view that you're getting, and you're trying to check that people don't have someone in the room, aren't doing anything untoward. And so, you know, that it's very interesting to try and check whether people are cheating just by trying to use their webcam and their audio. At the time of the exam, they went into iLearn. They'd already logged into the Zoom room, and basically I was releasing the multiple choice questions and the essay, which was submitted through Turnitin. So they just completed that over 90 minutes. And it was really interesting to collect the feedback. So this is quite sort of honest feedback about what people thought. We had the majority, you know, sort of around sort of 80-something%, high 80s%, thought it was great or okay. There were a couple of people who didn't think it was so good or had technical problems. One person freaked out because they had technical problems. But I assured students in advance that there was going to be, you know, allowances for people who genuinely had technical problems. And so it was, all in all, it was actually, while it was a nerve-wracking experience, it was, I think, by the end of it, people thought that that was a sufficient way to run an exam. I found it nerve-wracking because it was high stakes. It was new to me. It was imposed by external upheaval. It was new to students. There was a lot of information that they needed, and it wasn't institutionally supported, the sort of invigilation that I was trying to instantiate. The robustness of the actual invigilation, I think, is debatable. If students really wanted to cheat, they could have found ways to cheat. However, I think students on the whole really appreciated the attempts to uphold integrity, as opposed to, well, you're just going to do it online and we're just going to trust that it's you sitting in the room and not someone else that's logged in as you. The upfront communication could potentially have prevented some cheating, is the sense that I get, although there's no real way to verify that. But it does appear that people were sort of on task in their room alone, generally doing the right thing. Universities are now more prepared for remote invigilation, but it's a big challenge. There's reluctance to strive for robust processes due to the huge cost and effort to scale invigilation. And one of the things that I think really played a key feature in upholding the integrity was the design of the questions, that making sure that the questions related to the unit content and even required a personal response based on the sorts of experience that they'd had, meant that they couldn't just enlist someone that was good at sort of educational technology, which was the subject that we were studying, to just come and answer for them. So I think it's it's going to be very interesting to see in the future, as a result of COVID, how remote invigilation ends up landing over time.
Thank you, Matt. I know a lot of universities are thinking about remote invigilation. Some have taken the stance that they're not going to go down that path, and others are still exploring. So, and I think, until COVID hit, none of us even knew what remote proctoring was. So it's opened up a new language for us. All right, over to the fourth panelist. So great pleasure to announce Associate Professor Michael Cowling. Over to you.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, so ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm your closing act, and then we're going to move on to questions. And so, as with Matt Bauer, when I was asked to talk about assessment, I thought, well, what am I going to talk about? And I thought that I would actually talk about something a little different, which is kind of an argument towards why we should not necessarily assume that just because we had this terrible pandemic that everything should go online. And so instead, I think that there is still value in talking about what I call synchronous online experiences, and in particular this idea that we maybe still need didactic learning, some sort of lecture component. And my slides, I always try and get as many titles as I can into a presentation. So this one has 3: synchronous online learning, how will the digital age change the teaching and assessment experience, or colloquially, why do we still need the lecture? And this is kind of based on an article that I wrote with Chris Deneen from the University of Melbourne, which I'll paste in the chat just as a way to sort of, plug the article, and the link's also in the slides as well, so you'll see it come up. But basically this article argued that even though we are going online, and here's a picture from our recent ASCOLite executive meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago up in Brisbane at Griffith University South Bank there. Even though we are going online, there is still value in having asynchronous experience. And this picture I thought was really interesting, and this was shared on Twitter, so I'm not sharing anything, commercial in confidence, because we had a combination of people come along to the meeting. Kwong Yui there in the top right-hand corner, she had to come in online because she was in New Zealand and she wasn't able to travel to Australia, but all of the other participants actually came to Griffith University, and we all sat around the table there and had an executive meeting. And we thought that was really important that we had that executive meeting face to face, because we were able to network and talk to each other in ways that we just weren't able to do online. And in fact, we had an executive meeting online during COVID where everyone was dialed in, and it was an inferior experience. The people that were online felt like they didn't get an opportunity to participate as much as they wanted to. And so when we got the opportunity to bring everybody together, except for poor old Kwong Yui there in the corner, then we did that. Right. And so my argument is that coming back into 2021, coming back into our ability to do things face to face, that maybe there is value in doing things face to face, or that even if we choose to do things online, then our choice might be to continue with synchronous experiences. And so when you have a look at that article that I posted to you, and there's the link on the left-hand side, just in case you didn't see it in the chat, Chris and I make the argument that there is value in these synchronous teaching experiences. What happens, I think, often is that when people start talking about going online, they start saying, oh, well, we're going to change, we're going to go online, and now that we're going online, we're going to flip our classroom, and we're not going to have lectures or workshops anymore. We're not going to do Zoom, right? We're not going to have these synchronous experiences, because if we're going to go online, why do we have those experiences? But Chris and I argued that those kinds of experiences, they can be good pedagogy. And it was actually based on a comment made by a Vice-Chancellor, and I won't tell you which Vice-Chancellor, but if you go and read the article, you'll find the name of that Vice-Chancellor, who suggested that lectures in general were a crutch for poor pedagogy. And Chris and I argued that that wasn't the case. We said, look at TED Talks as an example of something that is didactic in nature, but is very, very entertaining. Or if you want an example of a longer one, because TED Talks are often quite short, then Randy Pausch and his last lecture that he gave, Randy was an ex-Disney Imagineer, is a great example of a very powerful, very evocative lecture that is great didactic content, is the kind of content that we want people to deliver. So then, of course, your question then becomes, well, how do I decide whether or not I should deliver that kind of lecture, or whether or not I should do something that's a little bit different with my online experience? And the argument, of course, is that the pedagogy should come first. We need to reflect on our practice, and we need to decide whether a lecture is the best method for us to deliver our content. And sometimes it is, right? There's a reason we've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. Sometimes it makes sense to do that. And just because you've got examples of a poor lecture, and we've all got examples of the lectures we fell asleep in when we were undergraduate students, doesn't mean that lectures in general are poor practice. You need to think about what suits your practice best. And if a lecture or a didactic delivery suits you best, that's fine. If it doesn't, then that's fine too, and do something entirely different. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I do all sorts of interesting things with technology, but in this case, I'm just arguing that the lecture still has a place. So yeah, what's the idea here? The idea is that we should lose those assumptions. We should lose the lecture. And to their credit, when this Vice-Chancellor made this comment, there was response from a lot of our Deputy Vice-Chancellors academic, who said, basically, this may be a bit generalistic. And maybe we should think a little bit more, and it depends, was often quite their response. And so technology doesn't make lectures bad by default. And in fact, technology can make teaching easier. And we all know that. Like, I think everybody that's in this room knows how technology can make teaching easier and more versatile. And Amanda and Jack and Matt have given you great examples of how technology can make teaching easier and more effective. But it can also make it worse, and we've probably all seen examples of that as well. So my argument is that the difference ultimately is in the pedagogy, and the pedagogy that we're actually using, and that just because we had a pandemic, and just because we all decided to go online, the key here ultimately is reflection and a thoughtful commitment in improving both teaching and the teacher. Because remember, technology is a tool, and that it carries no inherent pedagogical value. And I think Chris Deneen wrote that because it sounds way too smart for me. But anyway, with that, I'm going to pass on to Angela to keep on sharing. And I think we're going to move on to answering some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael. I love the title of your paper, and I did share it on LinkedIn when I first referenced it a couple of weeks ago. Good riddance to the boring lectures. Technology isn't the answer. Understanding good teaching is. So if people haven't read Michael's paper on the conversation, please go ahead and do so. All right, we're going to move into question time. And so if you've got questions, I'll encourage you to post them in the chat, and I will try and work through them. So please bear with me while I go through the questions. But while you're thinking of your questions you'd like to ask a panelist, and you can post a question to any of the panelists, or you can say you would like Jack to answer it, or Michael, or Amanda, or Matt. I'm going to start off the questions while people are thinking of theirs. And this goes to all of the panelists, and maybe just a quick response from all of them. What do you see, or what is the biggest challenge you've faced in assessment in recent times? So particularly in your discipline area. So we might start off with the sciences, so the physical sciences. So we'll go to Michael, and then maybe Jack, physical and biological sciences. We'll do those first. So Michael, we'll start with you, and then Jack.
Awesome. The hard sciences, Angela, although I hard computer science. But yeah, so okay, science, what I do, which is predominantly computer science. I mean, Matthew Hillier will tell you that the biggest challenge often with this is that we are trying to do some sort of authentic assessment, and that the tools that Matthew's been talking about for years and years make that much easier, but that traditionally assessment and exams in computer science were very inauthentic. You would get students, and when I was a student, you would write out the source code in a book and somebody would read that source code, and they would be expected to work out if that source code worked to run a particular program. And it's just such an inauthentic environment because we all leave out semicolons and equal signs and things like that, and we trust the compiler to tell us when that happens, and writing it in a book just makes no sense. But I think the other thing in general, and as with Matt Bauer, I'm lucky enough to have been part of Matthew Hillier's Transforming Exams project, which finished a couple of years ago. We found that the hidden elephant in the room often with assessment is that we want to authenticate people using exams, and that's why we're actually running an exam, to make sure that the guy that's sitting the exam is actually the student that's enrolled in the unit. And a lot of people don't like to talk about that, but it's often the reason that we will do an invigilated exam. And so whenever we replace an invigilated exam with something else, we run the risk that we lose that authentication aspect. And in fact, when Matt Bauer was talking, a few people said, well, how do we know that the guy that's doing the exam that's in front of his video camera is actually the guy that's supposed to be doing the exam? And Matt mentioned that as well, I think, in response. So I think that's the biggest challenge for us, is that authentication. And it's funny that nobody really wants to talk about it, but it comes up often. But I'll hand over to Associate Professor Jack.
Over to you.
Hi. Yeah, so look, for me, exams is not the biggest issue, because we went to open book in my setting, and there's a lot of case-based exam questions we were forced to write and give students a series of experimental tools and ask them to design an experiment. And it's actually more authentic to my setting and that kind of thing. But the biggest challenge for me is, of course, the hands-on laboratory skills. I mean, that's tied in with accreditation in chemistry and with microbiologists that are doing diagnostic testing right now for COVID. You'd hope that they would have some hands-on laboratory training. And it's all about delaying the inevitable. Hopefully, when borders open again, we have given them enough breadcrumbs to learn something about that space before giving them maybe an intensive experience, 2 weeks, 3 weeks of nothing but immersive lab. That would bridge that gap. But it's what we do in the meantime that's meaningful that is kind of the problem I've been focusing on. Much like right now, if you have a broken tap, instead of maybe calling the plumber straight away, you would go on YouTube and find a video of someone fixing the tap or fixing something to do with your car. We've been making a lot of videos in this space to demonstrate certain equipment in biological sciences, certain bacterial cultures, and how to work with them safely. Again, it's not perfect, but I think it makes up a surprising amount of space when we talk to the students and see what they really took away from the pracs. If you're just in the labs with no cognition and you're just going through the motions, you actually learn a lot less than being forced to think about what the key concepts are and waiting for the chance to actually demonstrate those skills in person. So it's a delicate dance that we're doing at the moment, but that's the biggest challenge in my setting.
Good. Over to Amanda and then Matt.
Hey, everybody. So in accounting, a lot of what we do is analysis with data. You would go into the real world and you'd get a client, you'd have to figure out what's going on, make some analysis, do some analysis, make some recommendations. So for us, the biggest challenge is assessment at scale. For us, a small cohort is 300. And our first year cohort of introductory accounting, which will be my subject next year, which will have 1,800 students in it in its heavy semester and 400 students in its light semester. So I mentioned in the chat that the issue for us is even 5 more minutes of marking adds 150 hours of marking across such a large cohort. So because we have large numbers, that also means that when you make changes, the budgetary impact is something that we probably weren't as cognizant of pre-COVID, and is something we're thinking about now. So, for us, where we have scale and we have professional accreditation requirements to make sure that at least 50% of assessments, we can be sure that the student who is submitting the work is the student that's enrolled. For us, the invigilated exam in many instances is what institutions are choosing. So now we're thinking along the lines of, how do I make an online exam more authentic? How can I optimize my online exam to minimize, cognitive overload? So the old ideas of, you would have your exam paper, you could take the staples out, you could highlight bits. There's no highlighting in online exams. So we're trying to figure out, is open book better at cognitive offloading? Where academics say you can't have a bit of paper to write a note on, creates excessive cognitive load on the student. So we're trying to optimize what we have at the moment. I know that there's lots of people trying to work out the authentic assessment in not an exam. And we just seem to be going in circles, stuck in that one at the moment because of budgetary considerations is the big one for us.
Yeah, it's an important issue. Lots of first year classes have large numbers of students. So, having 1,000 students in a class, and that does make, raise concerns around, how much time do we devote to assessment as well, and can we use the affordances of technology to help us? But then you've got the added issue that Michael has raised about, authentication. Is that person that's sitting the exam the person that's enrolled? Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, they're not perfect. AI systems aren't perfect.
No, that's right. Over to you, Matt. You're on mute, Matt. You're on mute.
Sorry.
Someone has to do it.
All good. So yeah, having interesting conversations in the chat around that issue of, invigilation and making sure that the identity of the person is who they say they are, or and which is one that we're all familiar with. So I might diverge off to another big issue, which is assessing creativity and design. Because in my units, we want our pre-service teachers to be really confident and capable designers with learning technologies. And that doesn't reduce easily into rubrics. It doesn't reduce well under timed conditions. Having students write about design, which is, what factors would you consider, which is something that we do in the exam, isn't necessarily well correlated to students' actual capabilities to design. A lot of it because of that fine motor skills that, Jack was sort of talking about. Being in the lab, actually doing it, is different to just being able to write about what you do and talk about. So yeah, I think that there's always got to be a compromise, and at some point, we need to do our best with assessment, but also understand that there's going to hopefully be some great learning in there for students that they value that might actually not be able to be fully captured in our assessment due to the constraints that we necessarily operate under.
Yeah, I'm just looking through the chat to see if there's any questions, and I'm seeing that the panelists are responding to the questions that are already being asked. So I might move to the next question that I've got lined up. And that is, what do you see as the future direction of assessment? So Matt, we might, Jack, we'll start off with you this time. Where do you see it heading?
The future of assessment. I think universities, and we're doing this a little bit at UQ, are trying to set up more hubs that are global. So instead of having to do everything online, if you could partner with institutions globally or locally, and the students can still have a face-to-face experience, even if they're remote, at least when it comes to the most important assessment, I think that's the only way we get through this, because if we're trying to go at this alone in single institutions, it's just not flexible enough globally. This is not something UQ has figured out by any stretch of the imagination. One of our strategic visions is how do we make the right partnerships in the next 5 years so that this is a possibility. But I think authentication, online-only assessment, down that way is madness. So I think as much as we can bring that face-to-face component across the world through partnerships has to be the way forward, in my view.
Matt, Matthew Bauer having run some online invigilated exams, what's your response to that? What do you see as a future direction?
Yeah, look, I think that it's probably inevitable that we will continue to do some. There will be universities that do some online invigilation, and I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing. But I'd hope that we're able to move towards the sorts of things that Jack's talking about, and also, increasingly, unfortunately, slowly, but I also think increasingly we'll be able to use, AI intelligence to capture what people are doing more reliably. So hopefully in the future, some of these issues around, being in a specific location, and some of Michael's work around VR and what we might be able to capture in terms of cameras and 3D models, and so anyway, anyone might be able to be anywhere and with pretty high fidelity capture exactly what they do and have ways to automate some of the assessment of what they do. So yeah, there's potentially some exciting possibilities by combining different areas of technology evolution.
It's going to be interesting to see how AI infiltrates and VR and AR start to, have more sort of prominence in assessment as well going forward. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. Michael, what are your thoughts about the future direction of assessment?
It's almost like Matt Bauer set me up there. It was awesome. I'd already typed into the...
Oh, Michael, you've turned yourself on mute.
You're on mute.
Michael.
You're on mute.
Oh, there we go. I tried to chat and present at the same time, and it all fell apart. There you go. So I'd already typed into the chat spatial learning analytics as a term. What Matt Bauer was talking about, this idea that once you've got VR or AR, you've got this ability to do something spatially, then you can collect analytics. You can use artificial intelligence and various other techniques to collect analytics about exactly what the student is doing so that you can get a much more authentic task about, let's say, for example, looking at a model of the heart and asking the student where the various components are, and then getting a feel for how often they turned it around, how many times did they look at it, did they get the wrong idea before they got to the right idea, and use that to assess their level of knowledge. And so yeah, if you Google spatial learning analytics, you'll find a little bit about that. And yes, Matthew Hillier is exactly right in the chat. He's saying we did this, Michael. He's right. That grew out of the Transforming Exams project, and we wrote a paper in AskALUT a few years ago. I'm trying to get citations. I'm trying to get people to look up the paper, Matthew. That's the...
Great. Michael, can you put a link to that paper? Do you have that? Maybe Matt can share it in an email if you haven't got it with you. Great. Because people want to read that now that you've just mentioned spatial analytics and what Matt has just said. So I think people will be very interested in that paper. People put a spotlight on it now because we do see AI, affecting what we do in lots of different disciplines, So it wouldn't surprise me that AI and VR and AR sort of step into the assessment space. Over to you, Amanda. What are your thoughts about the future direction of assessment?
I saw a comment in the thing about removing assessments. How about getting rid of assessments? And I would count myself as fairly progressive when it comes to learning, but I wouldn't call myself progressive enough to go towards ungrading. So I don't know if anybody has read any of Jesse Stommel's work about ungrading. I think that it sounds wonderful. I sit in a program that's professionally accredited, so I have some concerns about the idea around going towards ungrading. But I really like the move of potentially using more AI and more, I guess, smarter ways of assessing the process. assessing the process of learning with things like, I don't know if anybody has tried Perusal, which is a really great collaborative annotating tool that actually analyzes student questions and comments to each other to see their level of insight. And that's an Eric Mazur product. If anybody has seen Eric talk before, he's a physics professor, and he's really into active learning, peer-based learning. I saw somebody say OER. Let's talk about student co-creation of assessment potentially as some way we might go down in the future too. I'm really interested in that.
Excellent, thank you. And I've just seen Matthew Hillier just post up the link to the paper, the Ascolite paper, on integrated mixed reality spatial learning analytics into secure electronic exams. So please pull that paper down and have a read of it. Look, we've got about 8 minutes left. So I can just hear echoing. So I want to move into the final question. I'm still haven't seen any questions from the participants. So I'm going to move into the final question, and that is what excites you and what are you working on now in relation to assessment? So we'll start with Matt. You're on mute, Matt.
Sorry, I was mid conversation with Melanie in the text chat. Yeah, so what excites me? Oh, look, I just love trying new things. It gets my adrenaline going. This time around, it's been online invigilation. I'd love to get into sort of some of the VR and see what we can do with that in teacher education, and also with children in classes as well. And yeah, and anything that's coming on with new technologies, just exploring ways that we can use that for learning and teaching. And of course, by consequence, that means how could we possibly use that for assessment?
Michael, what are you working on that's exciting you?
Yeah, spatial learning analytics for a start. But no, look, lots and lots of stuff. But yeah, my reputation around the traps at CQU tends to be the VR, AR guy. So a lot of what I do is in that space. More broadly, what I'd love to see, this is Michael, with his crystal ball, I'd love to see people get a little bit less scared of technology. I think a lot of what people struggle with technology is that fear of technology, and I think that's true for assessment as well. So again, talking about the Transforming Exams project, we saw that with people saying, oh, well, what if my laptop doesn't work on the day when I'm trying to do the exam? And nobody ever says that about a pen. Yeah, so I'd like to try and reduce that fear if I can, and I'm not sure how to do that. But I think it's something that would be really interesting to work on. But yeah, in terms of what excites me, I mean, if you look me up, you'll find lots of things like, arguing that we should keep the lecture because I want to keep my job. That's the example.
I like that. Amanda, what are your what's exciting you at the moment around assessment?
Yeah, so what's exciting me is I'm moving from, well, I'm not moving, I'm adding from my 300 subject portfolio, a 2,000 student subject to my portfolio. So I'll be assessing and coordinating 2 subjects, which is just going to be crazy. But I'm really starting to dig into innovative assessment for really large cohorts and trying to move away. I went to my learning designers and I said, okay, I've got this great new subject. It's huge. I want to do something cool and innovative that's going to get my students really excited. And I said, what are other large subjects doing? And they said, students make a video as a group. Students do quizzes each week, and then they have an exam. And I said, okay, I'm trying to blow the lid off what we might consider as the exam, as assessment, and really digging into student feedback and students as partners in this space. So that's something I'm really moving into, and OER, so co-creating our learning resources with students so that it's that co-created learning experience, which is scary because I'm sort of letting go of the reins a little bit, but exciting at the same time.
Great. And we'll have the last word from Jack. Jack, what's exciting you at the moment in relation to assessment?
Yeah, so it comes back to that laboratory training and laboratory assessment that I was speaking about earlier. It's a project funded by the Australian Council of Deans of Science, and we essentially want to make more of these laboratory resources using video for everyone. So if anyone's in the space of teaching any molecular bioscience, microbiology, cell biology, get in touch, because we want to collaborate with you to make videos that everyone can use for free to give students that virtual laboratory experience before they step foot into physical laboratory, hopefully sooner rather than later.
So, Jack, have you seen any of the STEM open labs that OU have offered? Have you seen any of those?
Definitely, and that's a really great model to build on. And I guess, in the molecular biosciences space, a lot of it is very specific to the lab or the equipment. So that's part of the project, to do a scoping to see how well serviced people are by the existing resources, and then build on from that.
Great. I will definitely put you in touch. Well, I'll definitely get my director for the Centre of Digital Innovation to reach out to you, because we're looking at creating some digital sort of assets in that space, especially in the lab space. Well, that brings us to the end of our fantastic session with the 4 panellists. So I would really like everyone, and I don't know if we can do a virtual clap, but I'd really like everyone to please thank Associate Professor Jack Wang, Dr. Amanda White, Professor Matt Bauer, and Associate Professor Michael Cowling for their time this afternoon, or this evening I should say, and their great insights into what they've done, what they see as their biggest challenges, and the direction of the future. I hope everyone's got something out of the panellist session tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure to chair it and to meet you. I know it's been hard. I was hoping to meet you in person. I have met some of you in person, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Now, Matt, did you want to ask the participants to fill out a survey or something, or fill out
Yes, please. So just paste that in. It's our normal generic transforming assessment survey. So apologies, it's probably a bit weird for this one, but just do the best you can. The other thing I wanted to announce, of course, is that we have been, Transforming Assessment has been sponsored by CAULT, which is the Council of Australasian University Leaders in Teaching and Learning. They've given us a small amount of money to redevelop our website, so thanks to CAULT for that. And our next upcoming session is the e-assessment, the International E-Assessment Awards. We'll be having selected winners from there to showcase what they did for their awards. And it's an international one, so we should get a nice selection of 3 or 4 presenters coming along. 7th of July, I will be sending out an email to those people who registered for our newsletter. You will see the details of the next session, and there'll be a link to the recording for this session also. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in about 1 month's time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, all the participants, and thank you, panellists. There's my applause.
Yeah, thank you, Angela.
No worries. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, all right, stopping the recording. Thank you very much.